need support today. What can be done? We can improve the access to health facilities, nutrition, safe housing, renewable energies, and reduce carbon emission. For instance, as the world's largest developing country, China recognizes its vulnerability to climate change, facing threats from melting glaciers, sea levels rising, and severe weather events. Hence, in 2021, China committed to preventing the building of new coal power plants abroad and has invested heavily in the development of electric vehicles and constraining coal consumption. Exim Bank issued 3 billion yuan for clean energy investment, which funds the construction of renewable energy projects, which also benefits neighboring countries as it reduces greenhouse emission and limits global warming. In addition, China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment published the National Strategy on Climate Adaptation 2035 to strengthen adaptation actions and improve the climate resilience of its natural ecosystems, as well as economic health and social systems. Furthermore, the Global Development Initiative proposed in 2021 aims to guide global development towards inclusive growth and aim for a better world. For instance, the implementation and the involvement of the nation with renewable energies and reducing carbon emission allowed more countries to reduce pollution and attain sustainability. Many projects were also launched to help developing countries. For instance, the World Bank initiated many projects in sustaining and investing to develop markets, institutions, and economies, which include pursuing low-carbon energy, providing safer water and sanitation, reaping the benefits of digital technologies, and so on. A recent initiative is the Project of Water Management and Development Project in Uganda, which consists of the integration of water resources, planning, development, as well as access to clean water and sanitation services in urban areas. Through this project, more than 1 million people received access to improved water resources. So, with financial aid and the overall sustainability of the country, developing countries would possibly be able to afford technologies and facilitate the reduction of climate pollution and improve living conditions. With more energy dependence, we obtain the ability to address electrification, deforestation, and so on. To conclude, in the future, I want to see my children, whether they're residing by the Gulf of Mannar in Sri Lanka, or if they're building their first snowman by the lakes of the Netherlands, they're all gifted with the same rights as we do, of living in a world where pollution and global warming won't be harming their everyday lives. And to do that, we have to start acting now. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Gao Yiqing. I live in Athens, Greece, and I'm a year 12 student who is studying in Byron College. As a young leader of climate change activities, today I'm going to talk about the economic impact of climate change. Many people believe that the main effect of climate change is increasing temperatures. However, this is only the beginning. Unfortunately, changes in one area have an impact on all other locations, since the Earth is a single interconnected system. Extreme droughts, water shortages, fires, rising sea levels, flooding, melting polar ice, catastrophic storms, and biodiversity loss are the current effects of climate change. Let us look at a simple example. The Sahel region, home to more than 6 million people, has experienced the water scarcity due to the climate change, becoming the phenomenon of drought. Although the Sahel countries has been liberated from colonial rule, they continue to follow colonial economic model. Agriculture is the backbone of the country's economy. It employs more than 60% of the population. However, the state invests less and less in agriculture. Large farming infrastructure has low education standards, outdated production methods, and low levels of mechanization and water conservation. Tropical storms are also getting more destructive, which can be deadly for any country. I was born in China in 2005, and at the same year, Hurricane Katrina wreaked havoc in New Orleans, Louisiana, in USA, before making landfall in Florida as a Category 1 hurricane. It may landfall again on the outer coasts of New Orleans as a Category 3 hurricane and weaken to the tropical storm more than 12 hours after the landfall. Hurricane Katrina has been removed from the hurricane naming sequence due to the unprecedented devastation in USA. A few years later, in 2013, Typhoon Haiyan, the world's most robust tropical cyclone, the most powerful storm in Pacific Northwest, and the second strongest tropical cyclone on the record in the region, swept the Philippines. The wind and resulting massive storm surge caused huge damage in the central Philippines. Officials confirmed that more than 6,300 people were killed during this storm, while the Philippine Red Cross said as many as 25,000 people were missing. More than half a year after the storm, a number of victims in the area continued to increase. Looking back at the natural disasters I have just described, we can see that thousands of people are suffering due to the adverse effects of climate change on the environment. But if we think humans have it bad, there's nothing compared to what many animals have to face. Because of all these harsh conditions created by climate change, animals are losing their natural habitats and even face the risk of extinction. Global biodiversity has declined by 68% over the past 40 years, most notably in Latin America, home to the world's most extensive tropical forests, where species richness has fallen by 94% over the past 40 years. According to calculations, the extinction rates of species living in tropical rainforests can be calculated in seconds. That is to say, since I started speaking to you now, countless species of animals have disappeared from our planet forever. Human behavior is the root cause of climate change. In addition to the noticeable environmental effects of climate change, our economy is also corrupting. According to the new study from Stanford University, many experiments show that global warming has increased economic inequality since the 1960s. Temperature changes caused by increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere have enriched more than great countries such as Norway and Sweden. However, this has dragged down the economic growth in warmer countries such as India and North Korea. These results show that economic growth in cooler countries accelerated in the years with above average temperature, but slowed in warmer countries. Historically, since the 1960s, countries with high emission have had the highest GDP per capita and fastest economic growth. In contrast, countries with relatively low emissions have seen GDP per capita decline. Historical data clearly show that crops are more productive when temperatures are neither too hot or too cold. People are healthier, therefore also more effective. This means that cooler countries, a little warmth might help. However, in places that are already hot, the opposite is true. For most countries, it is pretty confident that global warming will help with hurt economic growth, especially in tropical countries, where temperatures are often well above ideal levels. So, the question remains, what are the ways to save the Earth? Firstly, I believe we must limit the use of fossil fuels, such as oil, coal, and natural gas, and switch to cleaner, renewable energy. We should also work to improve energy efficiency, de-invest fossil fuels, and increase investments in renewable energy. This will promote the development of renewable energy industry and become an initial basis for future human industrial operations. Understandably, this will be a blow to the more traditional non-renewable energy industry. Therefore, we suggest that these companies develop more energy-saving projects and initiatives to transform with the times. Secondly, governments and supranational organizations, such as the European Union, need to subsidize green energy. Most governments have called on the general public to save electricity by saving electricity and traveling with low carbon options. However, I believe that personal responsibility cannot solve the climate crisis alone, since consumers have very limited power overall. current data from the International Energy Agency show that carbon dioxide emissions from the global aviation industry have increased rapidly in the past 20 years, reaching nearly 1 billion tons in 2019, which is equivalent to 2.8% of the global CO2 emissions from fossil fuels combustion. In addition, the World Wildlife Fund also described the aviation industry as one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and called air travel the most carbon-intensive activity an individual can undertake today. Changes in lifestyles of a few individuals cannot have the significant impact we need. Instead, we should pay more attention on developing new technologies to reduce pollution. I'm aware we cannot get rid of air travel. It would be detrimental to use as a human race, not to mention our economy. It is better to start from fundamentals, promote the progress of technology, and use the technical means to reduce air pollution caused by human travel. For example, we could develop kinetic energy and actively advocate promote sustainable and clean travel using alternative fuels. Additionally, more sporty transport options, such as cycling and walking, should be promoted. Not only does this practice help increase physical activity, it also helps to prevent disease, such as diabetes, lung cancer, and heart disease. Finally, we also need to consider historical emissions and the deindustrialization of Western economies. Using United States and United Kingdom as examples, these developed countries completed their development at a time when the climate problem was far from being severe as it is now. However, many developing countries today are under attack because of their emissions. Just because they start a bit later, will they be deprived of the right to create? In addition, many developed countries did not reduce emissions, but instead built factories in developing countries with cheaper human labor costs, thereby reducing their emissions. Any country has a right to better development, and this right should not be taken away. But at the same time, protecting the environment is a joint responsibility as we all share the earth. Therefore, more developed countries should share their more advanced and environmentally friendly technologies with developing countries. This will mean that developing countries can reduce damage to the earth while also still able to develop their nations. For example, a joint venture could be established between the two countries, and the more developed country could receive the dividends in return. I do not mean to criticize or offend with what I have said. I want to appeal to all sectors of society to consider and deal with climate change seriously. Every individual should do the best they can for our planet. It can be something as simple as recycling a plastic water bottle, or wearing more clothes in the winter in order to reduce a few kilowatts of electricity. Also, you can walking or cycling to the school or work instead of driving or taking a bus. There are plenty of little things we can do that aren't hard and also will make a very big difference to our lives. But if each of us is willing to do a little bit, at least we can mitigate the climate deterioration. More importantly, we call on governments and supranational organizations to take climate change seriously. Only if we take the first step will the climate problem be improved. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello everyone, my name is Eric. I'm 14 years old, and as a fellow representative of a younger generation, I wish to stress the importance of climate change. It will weigh heavily in our lives. Think about how the weather has changed throughout your lives. Has the temperature gradually turned warmer, colder? Perhaps you have noticed more temperature changing, or snowfall or hotter temperatures. Do you see animal patterns changing? These are all caused by global warming. A quote stated by the current King of the United Kingdom, Charles George: "Humanity faces many threats, but none is greater than climate change. In damaging our climate, we are becoming the architects of our own destruction. We have the knowledge, the tools, and the money to solve the crisis." Countries are taking a step towards a better climate by agreeing to cut down carbon emissions. We are taking collective actions, but we aren't taking enough. Countries aren't prioritizing the problem, making some countries back out of the process. Then the question arises, what if we get to the point where global warming gets out of control? The answer could be geoengineering. Geoengineering is basically a method to cool down the climate on a large scale. But keep this in mind, not all types of geoengineering are necessarily a solution to solve climate change, but they are more of a timekeeper for us humans to bring innovations to change the world for the better. Then how does it work? Oh, sorry. I wish to introduce solar and carbon geoengineering. Firstly, what is solar geoengineering? Solar geoengineering, in simple terms, is the emission of substances that are able to reflect the sun away. There are mainly 3 types of solar geoengineering, but I will be focusing on one of them, stratospheric aerosol injection. How does it work? The way stratospheric aerosol injection, SAI for short, works is by injecting a combination of minerals, such as sulfur dioxide, into the atmosphere, where it creates veils that prevent the radiation from entering Earth. A study from environmental research letters show that injecting these minerals into the atmosphere might be cheaper compared to rapid climate change, as every year we spend more than $200 billion to $2 trillion to combat rapid climate change, but aerosol injection will only likely be around 10 to 20 billion. This means that we are able to invest more capital towards solving climate change. However, there are side effects to be addressed. One of the main side effects is that SAI can give a reason for industries and politicians to delay the carbon neutral economy. Thus, we need to further emphasize the importance of this problem when the technology is implemented. SAI slows climate change, but it doesn't make the climate change disappear. There's a limit on how much SAI you can produce because it's a limited resource. So when we eventually run out, the consequences could be catastrophic. Taking into consideration that this is a newer field and other factors can be at play, so further research needs to be done. The world needs to understand climate change first, then we can implement various solutions to delay the effects of climate change. Once we understand the root cause of climate change, and if we do enough to help solve the problem without the use of unnecessary technologies, the less likely we have to use drastic methods to solve the problem. But as time passes, the more it seems to be likely. Now let's talk about carbon geoengineering, also known as carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture is basically absorbing CO2 out of the earth and storing it. There are various types of carbon capture technologies, including pre- and post-combustion carbon capture, which directly captures carbon from power plants. These types of technologies can capture up to 90% of all the carbon emitted by a power plant, but only 25% of all the carbon emitted globally is from power plants. Then what about transportation, general industries, and agriculture? How can we capture the carbon emitted by these factors? The answer could be direct carbon capture. This method requires specialized machine that captures the CO2 and stores it. Although it is an amazing invention, it is ridiculously expensive. But at the same time, engineers are developing cheaper ways of removing CO2. They have developed machines that are capable of taking in carbon, but instead of storing it, it transforms carbon into fuels, creating a net neutral carbon-based fuel, meaning that there's no longer a need for oil extraction, and more importantly, it is economically viable. Despite our technological advancements, there's still a problem. The world is aiming for a carbon negative emission of less than 2 degrees. Thus, we need to store the carbon permanently. But storing carbon does not come with a profit. Thus, no one will be incentivized to invest in such an expensive project. This is a scenario that governments and NGOs can play a major role in. In conclusion, technologies like geoengineering are very crucial technologies that might not solve climate change, but are very important to be invested to buy us some time before we ultimately find the solution. We also need to understand that not all individuals will agree with this movement, but these types of technologies will be a necessity for future mitigations towards the solution of climate change. I hope that others like me will stand up and move people, and more people will make a difference towards the environment. Thank you.
Thank you for all the young leader and the generation give out their thoughts and their thinking. So we thank you all your speech. And if you have any question, I hope you can ask it, and the young leaders will help to answer these questions. And they are looking for people to help us and to help support them to do the action to help the climate change and also help our environment. Thank you. Welcome for the questions. Okay, thank you for your all listening, and thank you again for the young leaders.
there's not, and it will be outlined. Go for it.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, may I please ask you all to take your seats in order for us to begin with the opening.
distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to declare open the 27th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Friends, let me begin by thanking our friends here in Egypt for such a warm welcome. My team and I know just how demanding hosting such a conference is and how many people have worked incredibly hard to get us to this point. So congratulations and thank you again. Now, as the UK's presidency comes to an end, I want to reflect on what we achieved together in Glasgow, and also what has happened since in our presidency year. Last November, the world gathered at COP26 against a fractured and fractious geopolitics as a once-in-a-century pandemic dragged mercilessly on. And yet, leaders recognized that despite their differences, often profound, cooperation on climate and nature is in our collective self-interest. And thanks to that spirit of cooperation and compromise, we forged together the Glasgow Climate Pact. Collectively, we achieved something historic and something hopeful. With your help, we closed the Paris Rulebook. We made unprecedented progress on coal and on fossil fuel subsidies. We committed to rapidly scale up finance and to double adaptation finance by 2025. We reiterated the urgency of action and support for loss and damage and established serious work on funding arrangements. And we hope that that has paved the way for a formal agenda item and tangible progress here in Egypt. And every party, and I repeat this, every party agreed to revisit and strengthen their 2030 emission reduction targets to align with Paris. So I want to thank the 29 countries which have already updated their NDCs since Glasgow. From Australia to Micronesia, India to Vanuatu, Norway to Gabon. And we also made progress outside the negotiating rooms with commitments from business, from finance, from philanthropy. Friends, thanks to the work that we did together, we achieved our objective, the goal at the heart of the Paris Agreement. We kept 1.5 degrees alive. Now, none of us could have anticipated the year that followed. We have been buffeted by global headwinds that have tested our ability to make progress. Putin's brutal and illegal war in Ukraine has precipitated multiple global crises: energy and food insecurity, inflationary pressures, and spiraling debt. And these crises have compounded existing climate vulnerabilities and the scarring effects of the pandemic. And yet, despite this context, there has been some progress in implementing the commitments that we delivered in Glasgow. Over 90% of the global economy is now covered by a net zero target, up from less than 30% when the UK took on the COP26 role. The biggest companies and the financial institutions in the world have committed to net zero. They've done so in force, with a global wall of capital creating green jobs and directing billions into the green industries of both today and tomorrow. Countries and companies are making tangible sectoral progress, from zero-emission vehicles to our breakthrough agenda, and are accelerating the rollout of renewable energy across the world. And the Secretary-General has been clear. Our shared long-term futures do not lie in fossil fuels. And I agree with him wholeheartedly. Every major report published this year underscores the point that progress is being made. And thanks to the commitments that we garnered ahead of and at COP26, and indeed in our presidency year, emissions in 2030 are expected to be around 6 gigatons lower. That is the equivalent of 12% of today's global annual emissions. And with full implementation of all the commitments in place today, including NDCs and net zero targets, the reports suggest that we are heading to 1.7 degrees warming by the end of the century. Not 1.5, but still progress. So to those who remain skeptical about the multilateral process and of the COP process in particular, my message is clear. As unwieldy and sometimes as frustrating as these processes can be, the system is delivering. And there are many people to thank for that, and certainly too many to name. The prime ministers and the presidents who have sensed the changing wind and indeed sought instead to harness it. The ministers to the miners who have recognized a just and sustainable future can only be delivered with a clean energy transition. The civil society organizations, youth representatives, and indigenous peoples who pushed us to consider and reconsider what was possible in Glasgow have continued to do so since. And of course, the brilliant officials, the brilliant civil servants around the world, not least in the UK's COP unit, who have helped to deliver progress. And yet, despite this progress, I fully recognize the scale of the challenge still in front of us. Just as every report shows that we are making some progress, they're equally clear that there is so much more to be done in this critical decade. Friends, we are not currently on a pathway that keeps 1.5 in reach. And whilst I do understand that leaders around the world have faced competing priorities this year, we must be clear. As challenging as our current moment is, inaction is myopic and can only defer climate catastrophe. We must find the ability to focus on more than one thing at once. How many more wake-up calls do world leaders actually need? A third of Pakistan underwater, the worst flooding in Nigeria in a decade. This year, the worst drought in 500 years in Europe, in 1,000 years in the US, and the worst on record in China. The cascading risks are also clear. Entire economic sectors becoming unsustainable and uninsurable, entire regions becoming unlivable, and the strain on the global movement of goods and the pressure of people to relocate because of the climate crisis becoming almost unimaginable. So this conference must be about concrete action. And I hope that when the world leaders join us today, they will explain clearly what their countries have achieved during the last year and how they will go further. It is very simply a matter of trust. Without its constituent members delivering on their commitments and agreeing to go further, the entire system falters. I will do everything in my power to support our Egyptian friends, and the UK is here to reach ambitious outcomes across the agenda, including on mitigation, on adaptation, and loss and damage. And we know that we have reached a point where finance makes or breaks the program of work that we had ahead of us. So whilst I would point to some of the progress shown on the $100 billion, I hear the criticisms, and I agree that more must be done by governments and by the multilateral development banks, including on doubling adaptation finance by 2025 and establishing a post-2025 goal. Ultimately, though, I remain hopeful. Look back to where we were before Glasgow. Look back to where we were before Paris. Indeed, as we mark the 30th anniversary, look back to where we were before Rio. With thanks to all of you, the UK's presidency ends as a demonstration that progress is possible, it is happening, and it is continuing. Yes, we need to accelerate that progress in the remainder of the decisive decade, but I believe fundamentally that we can. We know what we need to do to keep 1.5 degrees alive. We know how to do it. And Same, you and your team have our full support. So now, friends, let's make sure we deliver. Let's make it happen. Thank you. So, distinguished delegates, I would like to invite you to turn to sub-item 2A of the provisional agenda for the session, titled Election of the President of the Conference of the Parties at its 27th session. You may recall that in accordance with Rule 22, paragraph 1 of the draft Rules of Procedure being applied, the office of the President of the Conference of Parties is subject to rotation amongst the 5 regional groups. We now continue the cycle with a president from the African states. So it gives me great pleasure to propose that the conference elect, by acclamation, His Excellency, Mr. Sameh Shoukry, who will serve as president of the conference at its 27th session. I therefore declare His Excellency, Mr. Sameh Shoukry, elected President of the 27th session of the Conference of the Parties. I congratulate Mr. Shoukry on this election and wish him and his team every success in guiding the work of the conference. I now invite Mr. Shoukry to take his seat at the podium. Welcome, Mr. President.
السيدات والسادة الزملاء الأعزاء، أهلا بكم في شرم الشيخ. أهلا ومرحبا بكم في الدورة 27 لمؤتمر أطراف اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإطارية لتغير المناخ. اسمحوا لي أن أستهل مهامي كرئيس للمؤتمر بأن أتقدم إليكم جميعا بالشكر والعرفان على الثقة التي منحتموها لبلدي مصر، والتي عكسها اختياركم لها لاستضافة هذا الحدث الدولي الأهم والأكبر على الإطلاق، وانتخابكم لي لتولي هذه المسؤولية الجسيمة التي أطلع بها وكل ثقة في أن مصر ستجد منكم كل الدعم والتأييد لنمضي معا نحو تحقيق ما نصبو إليه. وأؤكد لكم هنا إن مصر لن تدخر جهداً في هذا السبيل، وأننا سنعمل على توفير أفضل الظروف التي تتيح لكافة المشاركين من كافة الأطراف الحكومية وغير الحكومية المساهمة في إنجاح هذا الحدث المهم وضمان خروجه بالنتائج التي نتطلع جميعاً إليها. واسمحوا لي أيضاً أن أنتهز هذه المناسبة لأتقدم بعميق الشكر لحكومة المملكة المتحدة الرئاسة السابقة لمؤتمر الأطراف على كل ما قدمته خلال فترة رئاستها وما بذلته من جهد لدعم وتعزيز عمل المناخ العالمي من خلال الأداء المتميز لفريق الرئاسة البريطاني الذي قاده صديقي الوزير ألوك شارما، الذي ساعدته بأن عملنا سوياً على مدار قرابة عام كامل لضمان انتقال سلس لرئاسة المؤتمر يبني على ما تحقق من زخم سياسي في غلاسكو العام الماضي، ويستكمل المسار نحو أهداف توافقنا عليها ونتائج لا بد أن نصل إليها. السيدات والسادة، إن مؤتمرنا الذي يبدأ أعماله اليوم هو 27 في مسيرة بدأناها معا منذ نحو 30 عاماً، وهي عمر اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإطارية لتغير المناخ. مسيرة متصلة أثبتت جدواها وأهميتها عاماً بعد عام. استطعنا خلالها أن نصبح أكثر إدراكاً للخطر الذي يهددنا، وأكثر وعياً بما كشفه لنا العلم من حقيقة وتبعات هذا الخطر، وأكثر اقتناعاً بما يتعين علينا القيام به من إجراءات لدرء والتغلب عليه اليوم قبل غد. إن مصر عازمة على مواصلة هذه المسيرة هنا في شرم الشيخ، لنجعل من مؤتمرنا هذا نقطة فارقة وعلامة مميزة على طريق طويل لا يزال أمامنا الكثير من الجهد والعمل لنضمن وصوله إلى وجهته النهائية، ولنجدد العهد ونرفع الطموح وننتقل بجدية نحو التنفيذ وتعزيز العمل الجماعي متعدد الأطراف من خلال التعامل الفعال مع أكبر تحدي يواجهه البشرية في الوقت الحالي. إن كافة الشواهد تؤكد لنا بغير شك ولا جدال إن تغير المناخ قد أصبح خطراً واقعاً يهدد حياة البشر في كل مكان وبكافة الأشكال. ويؤكد العلم بشكل قاطع إن نمط التنمية الذي سارت عليه البشرية منذ الثورة الصناعية وحتى وقت قريب لم يعد قابلاً للاستدامة، وإن الاستمرار على هذا النحو دون تغيير جذري سيؤدي إلى عواقب وخيمة تتحملها الأجيال القادمة بأكثر مما يتحملها جيلنا. ورغم كافة الأمنيات الطيبة ورغم كافة الجهود المبذولة، تؤكد الدراسات العلمية مرة أخرى من خلال أحدث التقارير الصادرة على مدار العام وفي مقدمتها تقرير اللجنة الحكومية المعنية بتغير المناخ، إننا لا نزال نواجه فجوات تتسع بشكل مقلق، سواء فيما يخص الحفاظ على الهدف الحراري لاتفاق باريس أو التكيف مع الآثار السلبية لتغير المناخ، أو توفير التمويل اللازم لتمكين الدول النامية من القيام بدورها في هذا الجهد. ولعل ما شاهده على مدار العام من أحداث مؤلمة في باكستان وفي قارتنا الأفريقية وفي أنحاء متفرقة من أوروبا وأمريكا، لعل تلك الأحداث وما خلفته من دمار تمثل عبرة وعظة وصوت نذير يتردد في شتى أنحاء كوكبنا، يدعونا إلى اليقظة والحرص وإلى التحرك العاجل لاتخاذ كافة التدابير اللازمة وفاءً بالتزاماتنا وتنفيذاً لتعهداتنا. سيدات والسادة، لا يخفى على أحد منا أن مؤتمرنا هذا العام ينعقد في خضم توترات سياسية تركت آثارها البالغة على دولنا جميعاً، ترتب عليها أزمات في امتداد الطاقة والغذاء. وإذا ظن البعض أن هذه التحديات من شأنها تعطيل العمل الجماعي الدولي لمكافحة تغير المناخ، فإنه من المحتم علينا جميعاً هنا في شرم الشيخ أن نثبت عكس ذلك. لذا فإنني أدعوكم جميعاً لأن نؤكد للعالم أننا ندرك حجم التحدي وأننا نمتلك الإرادة السياسية للتصدي له. ومن أجل ذلك فلقد كانت دعوتنا دائماً إن الوقت قد حان للانتقال من المفاوضات والتعهدات إلى مرحلة يحظى فيها التنفيذ بالأولوية. ومفاد ذلك حتمية التعجيل بتنفيذ ما تراضينا عليه في الاتفاقية الإطارية لتغير المناخ، وعززناه في اتفاق باريس وبرنامج العمل الخاص به، مع ضرورة رفع مستوى الطموح لكل الدول وفقا لقدراتها المتباينة بطبيعتها. وهنا يهمني الإشادة بالدول التي قامت بالفعل بتحديث مساهمتها المحددة وطنيا، ومن بينها مصر، وأثق أنني أتحدث نيابة عنكم جميعا حينما أدعو سائر الدول لأن تحذو نفس الحذو، لا سيما وأن التقرير التقييمي الصادر مؤخرا حول مجمل وضع المساهمات المحددة وطنيا كشف أن مستوى الطموح الحالي لا يرقى للوصول إلى هدف باريس. وهنا أيضا تقدر الإشارة إلى أنه من أجل التنفيذ الفعال للتعهدات والوعود، فإن هذه المرحلة من مسيرة عملنا المشترك تقتضي مشاركة أوسع وأكثر فاعلية لكافة الأطراف المعنية من غير الدول، والتي أصبح دورها لا يقل أهمية عن دور الدول، وفي مقدمتها القطاع الخاص والبنوك والمؤسسات التمويل الدولية والمجتمع المدني ومجتمعات الشباب والسكان الأصليين وغيرها. وتأكيدا لذلك فقد حرصت مصر خلال الإعداد لهذا المؤتمر على التشاور مع هذه الأطراف وإشراكهم في كافة الأنشطة والفعاليات، سواء فيما يتعلق بمبادرات دولة الرئاسة أو بالأيام الموضوعية المختلفة على مدار المؤتمر، بل وأيضا في قمة شرم الشيخ لتنفيذ تعهدات المناخ التي تبدأ أعمالها غدا على مستوى رؤساء الدول والحكومات. سيدات والسادة، إنني وإذ أبدأ اليوم مسؤوليتي كرئيس للمؤتمر لابد لي أن أدعوكم جميعا إلى وقفة للمصارحة حول حقيقتين لا مناص إلى إنكارهما، وهما: أولا، إن جهود تغير المناخ على مدى العقود الماضية اتسمت بقدر ملحوظ من الاستقطاب، ما أفضى إلى إبطاء وتيرة التقدم في عملية التفاوض. ثانياً، إن الحالة الراهنة لجهود الحشد وتوفير التمويل المناخ تثير الكثير من الشواغل، إذ أن تعهد توفير 100 مليار دولار سنوياً لم يجد بعد سبيله إلى التنفيذ، كما أن أغلب ما يتوفر من تمويل يميل بطبيعته إلى خفض الانبعاثات على حساب جهود التكيف، فضلاً عن اعتماد أغلب التمويل المتاح على القروض. وأظن أنكم تتفقون معي أننا لا نملك طرف الاستمرار على هذا النهج، بل يتحتم علينا تغيير مقترباتنا من التعامل مع هذا التحدي الوجودي، ويتعين علينا السعي بجد وإخلاص للاستماع والتعرف على شواغل الأطراف الأخرى وتفهمها، والعمل على الوصول إلى حلول توفيقية مقبولة تكفل تحقيق التقدم وتؤكد بالدليل العملي ما دأبنا على المناداة به من ضرورة ألا نترك طرفاً يتخلف عن الركب. رغم جملة التحديات التي نواجهها، إلا أن البشرية لا تزال أمامها الفرصة لتجاوز هذه المرحلة الصعبة، إذ ما توفرت الإرادة السياسية لذلك، وإذا ما استطعنا العمل سوياً بشكل متسق ومتناغم. ونرى اليوم الكثير من الشواهد على ذلك. فعلى سبيل المثال، يشهد قطاع الطاقة المتجددة طفرة غير مسبوقة ساهمت في انخفاض أسعارها بشكل كبير، كما تطورت تكنولوجيا التكيف في مجالات إدارة الموارد المائية والقطاع الزراعي بشكل ملحوظ. وشهدت السنوات القليلة الماضية تزايداً ملموساً في وعي المجتمعات، لا سيما في أوساط الشباب، بخطورة تغير المناخ، مع عزم أكيد على التعامل مع القضية بشكل مبتكر وفعال. ونما بشكل ملموس اهتمام وإسهام المجتمع المدني ونشطائه والعاملين في مراكز الأبحاث، وتزايد دور المرأة وتصاعد دور المدن والحكومات المحلية وغيرها، مما يؤكد أن الفرصة لا تزال سانحة لوقف هذا الخطر الداهم الذي يهدد معاش وحياة الملايين في مختلف بقاع الأرض. سيداتي والسادة، غدا تبدأ قمة شرم الشيخ لتنفيذ تعهدات المناخ أعمالها، حيث يتوافد قادة العالم هنا للإعراب عن التزامهم الراسخ بجهود مواجهة تغير المناخ وأولوية العمل من أجل مستقبل نتمكن فيه من العيش دون خطر وجودي يهددنا. وعلى بعد خطوات من تجمع قادتنا نبدأ نحن أسبوعين من المفاوضات والمشاورات الهامة والحيوية التي يجب أن نجتهد لتكون ميسرة ومنتجة. أدعوكم جميعا غدا إلى الاستماع جيدا لما سيعبر عنه قادتنا، وأطلب منكم الالتزام بتنفيذ توجيهاتهم وترجمة الالتزام السياسي الذي سيتردد صداه غدا وبعد غد في كافة أورقة هذا المكان إلى توافقات وتفاهمات على النصوص والقرارات التي نعلم جميعا مدى أهمية التوصل إليها من خلال هذا المؤتمر. أناشدكم جميعا أن تضعوا نصب أعينكم إن ما نحن بصدده ليس عملا تفاوضيا منفصلا عن الواقع، وأننا نخسر جميعا إن ظننا إمكانية تحقيق فريق لمكاسب على حساب فريق آخر، فمهمتنا جميعا أكثر نبلا من ذلك. تمتد آثارها لحياة ومعاش ومصالح الملايين من البشر حول العالم ممن يعانون من واقع حي